Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV. And just to give you an update on the shows that ended up not happening earlier this week, Steve Ossad was going to be talking about Bradley in Operation Cobra. It was all to do with internet connections. We will get that resolved. He will get it resolved, and he'll be back on later. And Glenn Harper, who was going to be talking about New Zealanders in Crete. It was a mix-up and a miscommunication, and then also internet failure. So he'll be coming back on, but not till he's going away for 2 months. He'll be coming back on in September. So we will address those shows. We'll get to them later on. If you are new to World War II TV, as always, don't forget to click subscribe, share what we're doing on social media, and the YouTube description below has all the information you need to know about my guests, their books, social media, how you can buy snazzy World War II TV merchandise, and all the other things that you need to know. So I've been looking forward to this show because Kevin Hymel, my guest, this must be his 5th, 6th, maybe 7th appearance, I don't know. We're kind of mates. I'm seeing him off screen now. He's put a silly hat on to compete with the host, which is fine. So we always have a bit of banter. We always have a bit of a kind of a crack there as well. But also, it's a serious subject tonight because 78 years ago this week was when Cobra was in full pelt. Operation Cobra, the breakout. We would had Steve been on. I've been talking about Bradley's role in it. Today we're talking about 8th Corps. Troy Middleton, who is rather overshadowed by other people in Normandy, notably Patton, who will be coming up. And of course, having mentioned Patton, it is worth mentioning that our guest, Kevin Hymel, has published the first of several volumes of his Patton books. And John McManus was talking to me. I'm name dropping at the weekend. And he has said it repeatedly. He thinks Kevin is the world's greatest living Patton historian, which, given how many books have been written about Patton, is some statement. And John himself is a renowned historian. So if he's saying that about Kevin, then we can only agree. So I'm going to bring him into the show now. So Kevin, having just introduced as the world's greatest Patton historian, you're now wearing a silly hat. So there you go.
Well, I promised Matt Brogy, his daughter June, I was giving him advice one day, and she saw the helmet in the background, and I put it on, and she was laughing her brains out. So I promised Matt that I would start off the broadcast with that. So. And you know, I always try to match your headgear when we do our shows. So, but no, thank you for that introduction. John has been a great inspiration, helping me along, helping me kind of realize my fascination and interest with Patton. And it's just something that you know that I've pursued along with my World War II and history studies. And it's nice to get that kind of recognition after so much time in the weeds, you know, not being published, finally getting the books out. So very, very humbled and appreciative of that.
Well, indeed, and John and others speak very highly of you. So between us, we've prepared a PowerPoint, and we are going to be talking about Cobra and Middleton's role. So I'll throw up the PowerPoint, and then we'll hand over to you. And folks, we'll just do questions as we go along, and at the end, whatever. We can be very free flowing and informal. This Kevin and me are mates, so lots of things to discuss. So let's start with General Patton, because the thing is, Patton's influence looms large over particularly the latter stages of Cobra, even though he wasn't kind of involved, but he kind of was. So I think before we get into Middleton, given that you are the world's greatest Patton expert, let's kind of break down and understand exactly what General Patton is doing in the kind of last couple of weeks of July, so that we're clear on that.
Sure. So as we all know, June 6th is D-Day. Bradley's First Army is pushing up from the beaches, penetrating into the Normandy countryside. Patton is this whole time, the whole month is in England. It's not until July 7th, exactly 1 month after D-Day, that he gets over to the continent. And he's basically waiting his time. He's waiting for enough troops and tanks and equipment to make it across the English Channel so that he can take command of Third Army and you know, maneuver around the Germans. I mean, you know, we don't know this at this point, but you know, we're waiting for him to take command. And he's really not doing a lot. He's really inspecting the troops as they come up off the shores. He's kind of rating other generals, what he thinks their performances were. He's very critical of the D-Day landings and what they should have done. But you and I were just talking about this beforehand, but there's this such a great mystique around Patton that when tanks enter combat, they're like, that's Patton. You know, we know the Germans know he's on the battlefield because tanks are now suddenly in the van and things are starting to move. That real initial movement occurs before his influence on the battlefield, put it that way. Troy Middleton is commander of the 12th Corps, I always get my Roman numerals messed up, but yeah. And so I'm sorry, no, he's in charge of the 8th Corps, and he comes online. He has not commanded a corps in combat before, but he commanded a battalion in World War I, got a Distinguished Service Cross for his service. They bring him back. He was the vice president of Louisiana State University. They bring him back into the Army. He commands the 45th Infantry Division, which, although a National Guard division, which the Army has always sort of, kind of got a snake eye towards anybody National Guard. He takes command of this division. He leads it into combat in Sicily and does a superb job. The 45th really does an excellent job of fighting veteran German troops. But then he has to leave the battlefield. He has a bad arthritic knee. Now, that's the official story. I've heard sort of various other ailments. I've never really nailed it down. But he basically goes back to the States. And there's such a need for experienced combat commanders to lead the war on the continent into France that Eisenhower basically says, if you have to bring him back to Europe on a cot, I will take him. So that's the kind of reputation he's garnered. By the way, just a little side note, I think I may have mentioned this to you. The movie White Christmas with Bing Crosby, a very famous Christmas movie, 1950s. It starts off in Italy or somewhere in Europe, and Bing Crosby is singing to the troops, and it's actually a goodbye song to the division commander. And everything I've seen in that movie tells me Troy Middleton is the model that they used for the commander, because the guy's walking with a cane and has to go back. But in the movie, the guy's from like New England or something. But Middleton was definitely a Louisianian. So by the time he gets to Europe, he is a combat experienced leader, maybe not in charge of a corps, but definitely with the infantry. And his, corps is put into the van. Everybody's lined up, between St. Lo and I'll just say the coast. And so this is Operation Cobra, July 25th, where they're going to have just a carpet bombing of the German front lines. Very well documented, very well known. The Americans take heavy casualties from friendly fire. But as the sort of breakout comes, it's really going to be the 7th Corps, which is right in the middle of the screen. And you did a great job of putting those patches up to make it easy to identify. So this is Joe Lightning Collins is basically given the task, and he's going to break out. And then Middleton's Corps is going to commence the next day. And I think this is, we were just talking about how 7th Corps gets all the attention with the breakout, and Middleton, how he kind of swings one division to the left and one division to the right so that he can strike with a 3rd division right up the middle. Well, Middleton's waiting, and the next day he's going to launch his infantry at the Germans, and they basically run into a brick wall. And he doesn't know what to do. He's kind of stymied by this. So he makes the decision. I'm using my words very carefully here. He makes the decision to put his 2 armored divisions in the front. He is an infantry guy. He doesn't trust armor, but he knows what he's doing is not working. So he's going to take John Wood's 4th Armored and General Grove's 6th Armored, put them in the van. There's Grove. Grove, in the interwar years, is one of this small group of officers that kind of sneaks off to a Civil War camp called Knox and practices Army tactics and maneuvers and creates doctrine. It really kind of is born out of the cavalry, which is stationed at it's escaping me, Fort Riley, Kansas. But these tank guys realize that the cavalry hates tanks. This is going to destroy cavalry. So they have to get themselves physically away from the fort. And that's how Fort Knox really becomes the home of armor. So while Patton is sticking with cavalry in the interwar years, Grove is one of this small cadre of thinkers of how do we use this new machine. So that's Grove for you. We got John Wood. We got P. Wood here. So this is P. Wood. And I say P. Wood. There is no P in his first name or middle name. But when he was a cadet at West Point, he got a reputation of tutoring so many of his other fellow cadets that they start calling him professor. And so everybody in the Army by the 1940s is calling him P. Wood. He is a artillery commander in the interwar years, but he serves under the 2nd Armored under Major General George S. Patton The two get to know each other. He later takes command of the 4th. And, projecting into the future here, we know that the 4th probably becomes the most famous armored division of the U.S. Army. They're going to be responsible for the race across France, the relief of Bastogne. They seem to be on the headlines of every newspaper, put it that way.
And yet he doesn't want to give them a nickname, does he? I mean, we have
correct.
the Hell on Wheels, the super. If what I read is correct, Wood says, we'll let our exploits on the battlefield tell our history for us. We don't need a special name. So it was just the 4th.
Yeah, it was deeds alone was going to be we don't need one. So, you have Hell on Wheels, you have Old Ironsides, Lucky 6. The 4th Armored, you're right, is the only one without a motto, without a statement like that. And it really is a testament. It's like exactly what he says. Everybody hears the 4th. They know it. Patton later in the war would go into hospitals and he would give some of the wounded a hard time, not like he did in Sicily, slapping soldiers. But he's like, why aren't you at the front? Why aren't you, out of this hospital? I don't think your wounds are that bad. And they say, what unit you with? And the guy would say 4th Armored. He goes, you stay in bed. You've done enough. It really had a lot of power of voice, put it that way. So here we are looking at the breakout. You can see that 7th Corps is really starting its way down. Now, if you look straight down from that big 8, the first town you're going to see is Coutances. And which I, in my ignorant days, used to call Coutances until Martin Blumenson set me straight. So here we're looking really at St. Lo on, I guess, I don't know if I have this turned around or not. It looks like it's on the far right. And you've got here. So
there's that running down from sort of top left to bottom right is the Saint-Lô, Perrier, Lessay road that is, the start line. And I think everybody who's watching, who's a bit familiar with Cobra, they are more familiar, as you said there, with 7th Corps, because 7th Corps break out of that rectangle, the rectangle that was famously bombed by that massive amount of heavy bombers. We had the friendly fire instance there. And I think the map that really explains things, we can move, is this one here. This is the one that shows that first initial strike by 7th Corps with the blues show you there with these dramatic arrows, and it's 2nd Armored, 3rd Armored, what have you there, and 8th is over to the left. And in my preparation to create these images, folks, it's really hard to find maps that show what 8th Corps do, because these are the maps, these are the official US Army history maps that exist, and it's all about 7th Corps. And I think that's partly why 8th Corps has been left out of the story a little bit. But also, before we get into the next thing, we had a question about what were the composition of the lead elements of the 4th and the 6th, because Rhino tanks, things like that. But I think before we even get to that, I think I'd like you to explain at this point the difference between what has become to be known as a heavy armored division and a light armored division, and also the combat command, so that everybody's understanding what we're talking about, because it's not a division necessarily moving like we have regimental combat teams landing on the beaches on D-Day, which are kind of a different way of describing an armored division. The same things here with these combat commands. So heavy and light armored divisions, and then combat commands. Give us a kind of a basic introduction.
Sure. So, I for a long time I would hear that description, a square division and a triangular division. And to me, that none of that made any sense. It took me a while to understand it. And so basically, and I'm going to use the word regiment to begin with, but then I'll switch over to what armor uses. So the idea is you have 4 regiments in a division, and you can rest one while the other 3 are fighting. And of course, in World War I, you're talking about static divisions in the trenches, taking large casualties. In World War II, you're looking at maneuver units it's speed and getting around are important. You're not going to be static. And the idea of 4 regiments just becomes too complex if you're trying to drive across a countryside. So the idea is, let's cut it down to 3. And for some reason in the armor, they, instead of saying, the 173rd or the 476th, it's simply Combat Command A, Combat Command B, Combat Command R for reserve. And the idea is you have 2 in the van doing the attacking. You have 1 in the rear all the time, either adding elements to those fighting units or rotating out entirely. Now, this idea doesn't really work in World War II. Everything's committed all the time. Sometimes there are some rotations, but a lot of times It's like they got to get as many men and vehicles and guns to the front as possible. But that's the big difference. The heavy would have 4 regiments or combat commands, even though they didn't call it then. The idea of changing down to 3 makes it more maneuverable. Now, in North Africa, we had the heavy divisions. And what they found was we modeled the heavy divisions off the cavalry. We modeled after what we knew. We know how the horses work. And so the idea was the tank replaces the horse. And we took horrendous casualties. So the idea that gets worked back in Washington, D.C., and the Pentagon and Fort Riley, places like that, is we need to integrate artillery, reconnaissance, and tanks. So they reduce the number of tanks in each regiment, but they increase the artillery, what's called armored infantry. So the tanks, encircle a town and keep going. Now that town is cut off, then you send the infantry into that town so that they can't be like a thorn in the side of the unit. So it's a whole different kind of way of fighting a war, and you kind of want to be lean and limber. And George Marshall, the chief of staff of the Army, he's also trying to produce as many divisions as he can. So he's making leaner divisions. And, he basically comes up with a 100-division plan. And I think we put to field like 96. I mean, it's pretty amazing. This prediction in 1941, comes to perfect fruition in 45. All right, so I'm definitely getting down the rabbit hole here. But so that's your differences into the heavy and the light, or I should say heavy and medium. But in all of this change, the 2nd Armored and the 3rd Armored remain heavy. So we're thinking this is going to be our big punch, and those are going to be under Collins. So obviously Collins is going to make the most progress. He's going to, do the most damage to the Germans. And that's not really what happens. Here's day 1. Yes, it looks incredible. But by the end of this operation, the 8th Corps is going to drive deeper into the German lines than Collins' 7th Corps. And the battle in Coutances, which is really the first town, and you can see it's directly south of that 8. The big goal is Avranches, and we'll get there. But Coutances is the first objective, and it's really assigned to Collins over there on the 7th Corps. And you can see them driving towards Coutances, but it's Jack Wood, P. Wood, that derives his 4th Armored, just hell for leather, gets there first. And just to explain Wood a little bit, very passionate guy, very much loved his men, would cry in front of them because of his passion for them and what they did. He basically maneuvers through a minefield when he gets to the edge of the town and writes a note saying, "Follow me this way," to his combat commanders. In fact, I saw that note at Fort Knox. It was on display at a museum, in their museum. That I was like blown away. This is something I've read about for years, and to see it right there in the museum. As he's working his way through the rubble of Coutances and some of the buildings, he realizes there's a German 88 artillery piece knocking out vehicles from 4th Armored. So he goes up to a guy's in a tank destroyer, which we know is just like a tank, just lightly armored. And he asks the guys personally, "Hey, go out, knock out that 88. And so what they did is they moved that they directed the turret, perpendicular to the whole vehicle, and just drove up to this alley and bam, fired 2 shots, knocked it out. And Wood walks up to him and says, "Thanks, those Germans were ruining the war for us." Real frontline kind of stuff. And what happens is I think it's the 3rd Armored Division. I can't see the screen. It's either the 2nd or the 3rd, the one that's driving to Coutances. They actually see Wood's tanks, and Wood sees them and thinks they're Germans, and they start exchanging fire. And the guys under Collins are like, "Hey, cut it out." And they said, "How do we know you're not Germans?" And they said, "Cut it out or we'll tell P." And right then they knew, like, we know who P is. The Germans don't know it. They stopped firing. And so that is really the first big achievement of the breakout of Cobra, is 4th Armored Division capturing Coutances, which it wasn't supposed to. But because of, one commander.
In my prep for this, when you read it's a pity we didn't end up doing the show with Stephen Ossad, because anyway, but it would have been nice, because when you read what Bradley was saying about Cobra, the 7th Corps' role seems pretty clear. Bash through that bombed rectangle, drive on through, push the Germans on, and create space to bring what James Holm would call big war into play. And when you read about 8th Corps, one of the things it keeps saying is to keep the Germans pinned to their front. And I keep reading that phrase. I kind of can't really kind of work out what it's really supposed to mean, because you have got the remnants of the German divisions there in their way. You have got a good road network ahead of you. So, but as you said there, they end up 8th Corps kind of, they start off after the 7th, but they kind of pick up momentum sooner. And as they go through Saint-Sauveur, the Landelin, and places like that on their way to Coutances, they start, picking up pace. So we want to address, because it was asked earlier about the Rhino tanks, and it gets a bit complicated, because there's, as we said, there's 7th Corps, there's 8th Corps, there's 4 armored divisions involved in this, there's combat commands, blah, blah, blah. Now, how, from your interpretation, what is the makeup of the leading elements, the van of the 4th and the 6th in the 8th Corps push, in terms of Shermans and indeed Rhinos? What was being put at the front, and for what purpose?
So real quick, Rhinos are basically metal teeth welded onto the front of tanks to plow through hedgerows, those those hills that separate farms in the Normandy hedgerow country. And this is seen as the solution, finally, from all of this fighting, because if a tank just rolls over the hedgerow, the Germans would just hit it in the thin armor underneath. So the concept is, and they use the German obstacles from the Omaha and Utah beaches to create these metal prongs that you put on the front of a tank. And they realized if you just sent one tank through, the Germans would just blow it up. So they would have to line up like 5 or 6 tanks and charge the same hedgerow at the same time. And this was going to be a war changer, a real difference maker. But with the breakout of St. Lo, you leave the hedgerow country. And it was almost too little too late of an invention. Having said that, a lot of the photographs I did find did show tanks with hedgerow cutters on them as they rolled through towns. In fact, there's one, I don't know if I provided it to you, but the censor scratched out the hedgerow cutter on the front because they didn't want anybody to know about our secret weapon. But it really did not play a role in the breakout. I mean, the bombers punched a hole through the German lines. The hedgerow, the farm country is left behind. You're looking at sort of hilly, undulated ground now. And you know it, Paul, you've driven these areas. They're much more wide open, very hilly. And you've got water as a bigger factor because, you've got the Saloon River and all these other rivers coming in. It's one thing I'd like to mention, looking at Coutances. So the 4th Armored takes it, and then you see to the west is the 6th Armored under Gros. And Gros is a little bit behind. They got caught up in a minefield. And they get to that waterway that you show there. And actually, it's that tiny stick of a waterway just west of Coutances. And, one of his combat commanders gets there, and Gros gets there, and they're discussing what to do, how to bridge it. And very famously, Patton rolls up and sees this and says to Gros, "What are you doing?" And he's thinking Patton's going to ask him to do something. So he says, "Nothing." And it infuriates Patton. He's like, "Why are you stuck here?" Patton goes and walks into the water. It's about knee deep. He's like, and there's Germans. You can see Germans on the hill beyond. And he's like, "Get your damn tanks across this." And it's a big humiliation for Gros, for the combat commander. Well, I actually talked to one of the staffers of the 6th Armored who was there. And he told me, he said, what Patton didn't realize is this was a shore area. They were at low tide, and they knew high tide was coming. And that's why they were discussing bridging equipment and things like that. They wanted to do it smart. And Patton is all about haste and being of the moment. And so in that scene, obviously, is reenacted in the movie Patton, except in Sicily, not in Europe. But, I think that shows both the Patton, the passionate commander, but that his division commanders knew what they were doing too. They weren't being lazy. They weren't stalling. They were thinking long term. But that puts Gros in a bad light in Patton's eyes. And it's going to kind of push up the Wood's star even more. In fact, because of this incident, as Wood is rolling south, he gets word he is now to take Avranches, which was really Gros' objective. So that little incident at the river has a pretty, long-lasting effect because Avranches, as we know, is really now the key town because it's got all the roads. You've got the Atlantic on one side, so you're not going anywhere. And the Brittany Peninsula really kind of sticks out. It's going to be a whole new landmass. So if the Germans can hold Avranches, they keep Patton from getting into Brittany. If they lose it, the cork's out of the bottle.
Yeah, no, definitely. And just to draw a line under the Rhino so we can move on. I mean, over in 7th Corps, if you look at 3rd Armored's initial advance, because everyone knows that first advance by 7th Corps didn't move with the speed that they'd hoped to because of the reeling from the bombardment, and Pat Bradley's getting a bit annoyed, but I always kind of describe it as like a steamroller starting moving. At the beginning, its movement is like imperceptibly slow, but once started, you kind of can't stop it. And
Right.
There's those first bits off that main road, the Saint-Lô-Perrier road, where you can see there are hedgerows either side of the main roads that look like they've been cut out by rhinos for the first maybe couple of miles or something. And then clearly, because they start progressing with speed, because Byron's Panzerlehr have been smashed to smithereens, they all just revert the road. So I think there was a bit of use in the very early stages for like a couple of miles, which was maybe helped a bit. But then I think once the breakout is on, as you said there, the roads become more important, and you break out of hedgerow country. So that we'll draw a line under there. But we'll move on and carry on talking about the next. We've got some photos, folks. I'll show them of the break of the push into Coutances, and you know what. Let's going back to the 4th and the 6th again, these 2 armored divisions, because they say their remit had been to kind of be supporting to 7th Corps. But at what point does Middleton commanding 8th Corps realize that there's more of an opportunity? Is it like the first day, second day? How quickly is information getting back? And indeed, where is he in the column? Is he like up front near 4th or 6th, or was he miles behind?
I don't know his exact location, but it is after the first 24 hours that he realizes the infantry is not working, and he puts the armor in the van for the next, so it'll go in the next morning. And it just, I mean, look at all this mechanization here. Prior to this, all the images are of infantrymen walking down roads, climbing over hedgerows. This is so different. You've got jeeps, trucks, tanks, and you can see we're not in hedgerow country anymore. We've got old aqueducts here that, have been blasted, that were used as railways. Obviously, you can see the railway ties. And it just takes on such a different atmosphere. I see Benjamin Allen commenting. And I'll just say, too, I think one of the reasons people are asking about hedgerows, there's a scene, what is that, Belton Cooper's book about the Third Armored, and that Patton goes and sees them welding them on and makes this decision. When Belton Cooper talks about what he did in World War II, it's very interesting, very accurate. But he's even admitted, not to me, Steve Zaloga, that the bigger picture stuff that was done by other people and incorporated into his book. And there's some claim that Patton said no to the Pershing tank. Patton had nothing to do with the Pershing tank. Those decisions were made back in Washington, D.C. But a lot of people glommed onto that story from Belton Cooper's book. But I tell you what, go forward another picture too. There's one I really want you to see that I think. So that's what Coutances looks like. Now, this is not from the American Army. This is from the American Army Air Forces bombing. And Steve Burke writes very well about this, bombing the towns to clog the roads so German reinforcements can't get to the front, bombing railway lines, anything that slows the German army from getting to Normandy. Next. So that's Coutances. You can see the damage. We have that. I would love to find out when we started putting tree branches and twigs in guys' helmets and on tanks. And that's obviously, to protect from the Luftwaffe. But it's something we almost didn't need. We really, had great possession of the skies. It was the Germans who were really needing to disguise their vehicles. So this is an interesting photograph. This tells a story that you might not see initially. But anybody who's familiar with Albin Erzik, who wrote 2 books about his time in World War II, he went into a field before 4th Armored got committed, and he saw 3 American Sherman tanks knocked out. And on the other side of the field was a German, I guess it was a Panther tank. And what he realized is the German had used the American White Star on the hull as a target and knocked out each one. And he gets the word up to John Wood, and Wood decrees to paint all the White Stars black. So if you look at the size of those tanks, you can see there's a star there, but it's black. And that's how you can always tell, in the tank behind it too. And that's how you can always tell 4th Armored Division tanks in World War II. They're the ones with the blacked out stars. Now, the 10th Armored is going to copy that, so it gets a little confusing later on. But I think that's such an interesting story, and it's a testament to a lot of the leaders in the American Army that they would listen to the lower ranking guys and make decisions that affect the
I
battlefield.
did a tour there a few weeks ago, and it was with a retired general. And I was saying, he said himself, there's not many generals that would take ideas from down below. They take ideas from across and from down, but few would take them from up there. And it's the, as you say, folks, it's the good way when you're looking at photos of Cobra, working out whether it's 4th Armored or 6th Armored. You can tell by the blackened out stars there. And there's some great footage. Search for it online. I didn't use it because of copyright, but search for a Brehal, which we'll talk about later, which is halfway between Coutances and Avranches. And there's a whole column of Stuarts and Shermans going through it. It was civilian footage rediscovered fairly recently. And every single tank going past has a Rhino hedgerow cutter. So interestingly, in that particular town, of the particular footage that was taken, every single tank rolling past has one on there, presumably not being used. But I guess one of the things we haven't really discussed yet, although it will come up, Kevin, is that if you're a tanker, be it in the 2nd Armored, 3rd Armored, and the 2nd have been involved since June, 12th, 13th, British 11th Armored, 7th Armored, the fear of what was ahead of you, the perception of the threat ahead of you was very real, even if the actual threat was different. When I had Peter Hart on talking about the 5 and 4 yeomanry, the fear was you burning to death inside a Sherman tank. That was the fear tankers went in. Now, the facts bear out the fact that not that many Shermans brewed up with their people inside in Normandy. That was a thing of the early, but that was the perception. So I think if you are a tanker in the 2nd or 3rd or 4th or 6th, even if you're not going to use those Rhino hedgerow cutters, I think seeing them on some of the tanks would have given you some confidence that at least someone higher up has given some thought to what you're going to be facing. Okay, you've said the hedgerows aren't there, but it kind of showed that someone cared about what's happening. So I think there's a morale aspect of Cobra. Bradley is playing, and Middleton, they're playing on the fact that they want everyone to feel confident about this operation. The attritional period is over. This is going to be it. Let's go into this supremely confident.
And, Paul, I wouldn't be surprised. I don't have any facts to back me up on this, except some of these images, because we don't see hedgerow cutters here. I would imagine the majority of the tanks that got hedgerow cutters were from independent tank battalions supporting the infantry. Right. Because that's where it would make a morale difference, that they're going along with the infantry, helping them out. So if the infantry gets stuck somewhere, they could roll through with a hedgerow cutter. Whereas the armored divisions, the concept is speed, and maneuver. And so where I really haven't seen hedgerow cutters on photographs of tanks from 4th or 6th Armored. I have seen them on tanks, but of course the sensors usually block out what unit they are. So I would theorize that those are, if it's not 2nd and 3rd Armored, with Collins, they were probably these independent tank battalions supporting the infantry. That's my theory.
I'm gonna go along with you on that. So let's talk about. We've talked about the fighting for Coutances. We've talked about that. That's kind of the first stage. Then I'm going to throw out this map now, which I've carefully added 6th and 4th patches there to give you an idea. So we've got two Coutances at the top left corner there, and then Créance and Brehal in the middle on the left, and towards the bottom off the map, and I've got another one I'll show you, is Avranches. And talk a little bit about the significance of Avranches, because it's on the coast. It's not, you can see Mont Saint Michel from there, but it's a real pivotal road intersection, isn't it?
Yes, like I said, it's for the Germans, it's the cork in the bottle. If they can hold Avranches, they can keep Patton's Third Army, the American Army, out of Brittany and all of its ports that the Allies need so desperately. Likewise, if the Americans can take it, they can reach those ports. They can really freely maneuver. Now, not only everybody's thinking ports at this point, but really also if you break through there, you have the ability to go the other way and encircle the German army, which is exactly what's going to happen. Now, there's a number of events, and you and I have talked about them, in encircling the German army. If they don't take Mayenne and its vital bridge, you can see Mayenne right there, or Le Mans, where they eventually turn north to Argentan over there on the right side of the screen, or Laval. If you can't take those, you're never going to encircle the Germans at Falaise and Chambois. But if you don't take Avranches, none of this is all of it is irrelevant if you can't take Avranches. And just looking at that map, you can see the importance of Avranches. You see the Cherbourg, you see Normandy, you follow it south, and then there's Avranches, and then bam, there's all of Brittany. And so this is why the Germans are holding so tight onto Avranches. they know that this is where the breakout can occur. And you look along the Saloon River and you see that's exactly where it all comes from. You know, the whole face of the war changes with, I want to say capture of Avranches, but it's really with Middleton's breakout. That, you know, it's no longer infantry pounding the ground. It's mechanized units. It's tanks, it's jeeps, it's trucks, you know, just plowing forward and just kind of changing the face of warfare in Europe.
And this, you know, thank you for that. And this brings us back this idea that I think the reason I want to do this show with you is that I think all of us watching have this idea that the Normandy campaign is slow moving. Sure, you get the movements in the Falaise Gap, but it's all this kind of inch by inch thing. And yes, it had been that way. The attritional phase through June and much of July had been that. But you know, you talked about it earlier, Kevin, and, you know, 4th Armored's incredible exploits, and Rainier is watching it, who's done shows about 4th Armored, you know, in the Ardennes and the relief of Bastogne. But we're talking dozens of kilometers kind of a day in this breakout down there, aren't they? And because Collins's 7th Corps do get a little bit bogged down a bit because they're running out of space, because the Germans are now being hit by air power. So you've got places like Saint-Denis-le-Gard, which is kind of nearly into Blue Coat areas later on, where there was that famous convoy of vehicles, German vehicles, shot up by typhoons of 120 vehicles over 3 miles or something. So one of the problems facing 7th Corps is snarled up roads ahead of them of German armor that has been hit by Allied air power, which is great, but it is delaying progress down these roads. So that's why I think the 8th Corps push is so much more exciting, because people are talking in the sidebar about 75s and what have you. The thing is, 6th and 4th aren't really coming up against armor down that coast, are they?
No, it's not until they actually get into Avranches that there's some tank on tank fighting, and not even a lot of it. But yeah, you are talking about, you know, hedgerow fighting, taking yards every day if you can. And, you know, in the 8th Corps operation under Middleton, they go, 44 miles in 4 days? You know, I mean, it's such a radical difference. And you can imagine the morale. In my volume 2 book that I just got over back to Missouri Press, you know, I had a quote from a guy who said, you know, when we were fighting in the hedgerows, we were wondering how long we were going to live. Once we broke out, we were wondering if we were going to get home for Christmas. Like, just the psychological effect on soldiers was so deep, you know, like, oh my God, I'm going to live through this. You know, I'm not in the dirt. I'm in a vehicle moving, and there's people throwing flowers at us. You know, I mean, it's so different. You want to get into Avranches a little bit here?
Yeah, I want to talk about that little choke point north of Avranches, because one of the things that comes up when you look at the Normandy operations, but going back as far as Epsom and Perch and then Goodwood, is they seem to have generally a shelf life of about 3 to 4 days, because after that, no matter how well things are going, everybody's just bloody knackered. Everybody is just, you know, out of strength, be it the enemy included. But the thing about Cobra is Cobra goes on for like a week, which is unusual in Normandy. And there's that moment on that bridge just north of Avranches, because 4th and 6th, as you can see on that map, then I'll let you, Karen, because you're the expert, they're using separate roads. They're not going, they're kind of parallel alongside it, but they're using separate roads. But as you can see on that map, because of the estuary going into Avranches, they have to go together into Avranches. If you've been there, folks, you're in this little village just north of Avranches. And you can see, and Avranches is a high kind of medieval walled. In fact, you can see it in this photo here. There's Avranches ahead of us there. So it's almost like a Iron Age hilltop fort town with all this medieval castle. And at that point there, you know, these tanks have been, as people have said, there's not much opposition ahead of them. They're not like they're bumping into German armored divisions, but you know, you've still been 4 or 5 days of spitting the dust out of, and yet they get that point there, and there's Avranches ahead of them. So talk about the decision by Wood and Gros to push on into Avranches, because you don't really want to be taking Sherman tanks into a walled, hilly town there. So run us through your interpretation of those kind of decision-making moments that are facing 8th Corps as they push down.
Sure. Go back to that previous screen, please, the map.
Yep.
You can see that they're not just going into the town. They're circling around to the right. And so that's to prevent German reinforcement from getting into the town. Now, they can't prevent German reinforcement coming in from the south, but there isn't a lot coming in from the south. It's actually trying to rush in from the west. And I think that's going to be General, and I always it's not Dagger, it's Dager, his troops, and this is who Erzik is with. They're going to fight the Germans to a standstill there. The Germans are desperate to prevent, getting into Avranches. They know what the importance it is, but they're just a bit overwhelmed. But they fight them all day. I think this is on the 29th to try to stop them. Meanwhile, you can see that other blue arrow further to the right going straight for Avranches. Now, the Germans are going to defend a bridge there. And the way they do it is they bring in a convoy all draped with, red crosses on the trucks. And it's getting to be night, and the American commander lets them pass. And as they're going through, realize that these are enemy troops, and they open fire. One of the trucks has got fuel in it. So the German trucks are now highlighted, and so they stop them. And one of the German prisoners says, well, there's another group coming in behind us. And so they prepare for that. The Germans come and attack. Well, the Germans now hit one of the American fuel trucks, highlighting all the tanks. The commander, who I don't think Don Knox named in his book or any book I've seen, realizes that, my position's exposed. He pulls away from the bridge that he's guarding, and the Germans do penetrate into Avranches. So by the next day, it's no longer a question. I think Wood realizes the only way to really get in there is to get in there. There isn't the famous recorded statements like we had at Coutances, like going through the minefield and sending the message back. It's just the Germans are starting to crack. We have to take advantage of this while we can. The tanks do roll up into the city. In fact, there's one tanker knocks out a German tank, sees another one, knocks two out in quick succession, and then watches other tanks just pulling away, which is accomplishing the mission because the Germans are pulling back from Avranches. Another tanker sees of course, all the tanks are Tigers to the GIs, but of course, I think this was a Panther. And what he does is, when he's got a smaller Sherman, he simply rams it and then fires point blank 3 rounds. And in the account, I never read if they penetrated or not. They just rang the Germans' bell very well. And the Germans get out to flee and they just gun them all down. So the real kind of tense, hand-to-hand fighting or very close range. And the Germans are going to pull back and try to set up a perimeter south of Avranches. But there's one American, I think he mans a machine gun and kills about 30 Germans before he's taken out. So by that night, by the, I think it's the 30th, it's the day before August 1st.
Yeah.
Avranches has been taken. The troops have moved south of it. Patton goes to visit Middleton. I'm not sure exactly where Middleton's headquarters was at this point. And it's then they get word from Wood that they've reached, I think it's the Patton Bridge, which is directly south. You can see the furthest penetration there. And Patton says, in the history of fighting, wars have been lost by guys who fail to take a bridge. Just take the bridge and defend it. And that's kind of where the campaign ends. Last day of July. The next day will be August 1st. Third Army is going to be activated. Patton will be the commander. Quick side note, one of the tank battalion commanders takes his tank through Avranches south and goes and checks with his whole battalion, all of his lead tankers. And once he's satisfied that they've made a decent penetration, everything is safe, he goes to roll off and he encounters a German tank and quickly knocks it out. And that is Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams' first kill of World War II. Yeah,
that's a pretty good story. And I want to bring you back to both that decision north of Avranches and also the Pont-à-Beau bridge there, because the interesting story about Pont-à-Beau is if you ever go there, it's 2 bridges that cross the river there. There's a rail bridge and a road bridge. And it's kind of often, if you go there, it's described as the gateway to Brittany, and you can kind of see Mont Saint-Michel around the corner. There seems to be some kind of mix-up, a bit like Pegasus Bridge, about the Germans, about whether or not someone was supposed to have blown that bridge up in the face of the Allies, and a bit of a kind of a who's on first thing. And one commander thinks the other commander is going to do it. And in the end, it doesn't get blown up. There's a couple of shots I haven't included in this PowerPoint of American engineers repatching up the bridge, welding some bits, but the bridges are intact. And it's that moment there that you kind of, because that when they capture Pontarbeau Bridge, some elements get to Rennes like 40 kilometers away that same day, don't they? This is the lightning aspect of this that I think is really important. But I want to bring you back that bit north of Avranches, because I'm, in a weird way, like waiting for buses. I hadn't done a Cobra tour for ages. And I did 3 within 2 weeks back earlier this year. So suddenly I found myself down there a lot. And as I said, that kind of rule of operations taking 3 or 4 days, as Sheldrake was saying earlier, this is the 4th and 6th doing exactly what Sherman tanks are supposed to be doing, covering the distance. You got your armored infantry behind in the half tracks. You've got mobile artillery. You've got tank destroyers. All that snaking trail coming up behind there. But I don't think anybody could have forgiven Middleton and Wood and Grow for kind of stopping north of Avranches and waiting for a bit of time. And that's when Patton's kind of, as you said there, kind of coming up there saying, let's push on a bit more, because we now talk about it as that next stage. But I think it could have easily been that they stopped there. And if they had stopped there, I don't think anybody would have said they had done badly. They'd already done more than Cobra was supposed to do from their course. So talk a little bit about just that kind of bravery is maybe not the quite word, but that push on and just what it's like. You've read these accounts to find extra strength after several days to go on, because you're pretty much moving on into Indian country at this point. No one's quite certain. This is off the operational planning. They probably haven't seen the aerial photos of the Brittany campaign because they hadn't expected to go that far, had they?
No. And, you had brought this up earlier, how, and this, we really see this, Americans see this a lot in the American Civil War, where these great battles are fought in, Gettysburg and Antietam, and whichever side won was so exhausted from the fighting, they couldn't pursue the defeated foe, because the fighting was so intense. So not only are you facing, anybody facing a life or death situation in one day is going to have all of their adrenaline spent, going to be thoroughly exhausted, especially green troops who've never been in combat before. So, you combine that, the first time in combat with continuous combat. Now, amazingly, I've not seen any stories about soldiers being fatigued during this time. They actually talk about being energized because they're moving. There is that fear in the front ranks of what's ahead of us, landmines and whatnot, yet they keep rolling. Harry Cruz with the 6th Armored, I interviewed him. I remember him telling me just how amazed he was at all the devastation that his tanks were passing, dead horses, knocked out vehicles. And he said he finally saw an American soldier dead with a pickaxe in his back. And he said, that's when I knew what war was. Like, this is not going to be at a distance fighting. This is going to be hand to hand. And once again, maybe this is why you've got those triangular divisions that you can rotate guys out. In fact, Paul, they were moving so fast, their artillery had to hopscotch their guns behind the front lines, and they were not used to that. This was a whole new practice of war, no matter how much they tried it in Louisiana, California, under real wartime conditions. It's pretty amazing that they just kept moving and shooting, and that they had the commanders that they did, the low-level officers they did, the motivated soldiers. Patton used to like to boast, okay, these airborne guys are really elite. Well, the armor is your next level of elite. Yeah. That's going to be the strictest discipline, the highest esprit de corps. If it killed Patton, he was going to make sure the armored divisions had the highest esprit de corps. And so it really is a testament to the American soldiers at that time that they pressed that, combat forward. And yes, like I said, I've never seen a single account of guys going, man, after all this fighting, we were exhausted. They were exhilarated. They couldn't wait to get going the next day. Self-inflicted wounds that had been just, an epidemic during the hedgerow fighting practically disappears during this period. So it's really a breath of fresh air to everybody. Eisenhower did not think Cobra was going to work. After day one, Collins cannot get his troops moving. We talk about that there's still stiff German resistance after that first day. Also, we got to remember the entire ground has been pot marked, and it's very hard to move tracked and wheeled vehicles through an area that's basically just been pummeled for 5 hours straight. And here's the real evidence of the change of war. Not only do you have Germans surrendering in hordes, But then you look at that, you've got knocked out vehicles on one side and vehicles moving forward on the other. There was a case with the 6 armored. I think they were outside of that small town, begins with a B. I can't think of it. Breham. Yep. Thank you. That they broke through a roadblock and they came up on a bunch of German 88 artillery pieces. And they're like, oh my, like they didn't see them coming. They turn a corner and the Germans see them and they see the Germans and they go, oh my God, the Germans have us dead to rights. And the Germans just charge the Americans with their hands up. You know, they're like, oh, we didn't think this was going to happen. And so it is the complexion of the fighting just changes so dramatically and will continue that way through the entire month of August. But we could do another show on that later.
And indeed, I mean, we talked about Fritz Bayerlin watching that chaos and carnage of the bombardment from his chateau that I've stood in front of a few times. And it has been pointed out in the sidebar, of course, Panzer had already been taken a massive beating in the British sector in the previous weeks, and they're already completely under strength. But there's maybe in middle of there's still a bit of pride. There's still a bit of a sense of that we'll be okay.
We've held off this long.
Yeah, the pounding they take is something different. And I was reading recently because I did a tour with the grandson of a Ritchie boy. If you look at the accounts of the POWs taken in the Coutances Avranches, there's a major change in how beaten the Germans are psychologically. When they're taking Germans prisoner in the previous weeks, they're still, arrogant and haughty, and this is you may have got me, but you're not going to get my division. We're still going to smash you. We're holding. The Fuhrer is going to be, sending troops up. The guys they're capturing between Coutances and Avranches, they've kind of had everything knocked out of them. You can kind of see it in that photo there. Okay, that's enlisted men, but they have absolutely been hammered by the speed of this advance. And what they don't know is that the Germans, of course, have the second punch of Bluecoat coming to hit them just when they're reeling from Cobra. Bluecoat comes in over to the east, which doesn't get as much attention by Americans, and just adds the pummeling to the Germans there to the extent that then, as you said there, everything changes. But any more about the fighting for Avranches that you think you want to get across from the point of view of Middleton's leadership? Because we're coming to that crucial point now where you hinted already, where Patton comes in, the saloon doors burst open, in comes Patton, and we'll get to that. I'll show the monument in Avranches now, folks. We'll talk about the wounded in a minute, but there's that. There's the Sherman tank, and there's the monument in Avranches there, which is probably one of the largest monuments in Normandy, and it's to General Patton. It has all these arrows around the base of it, all the directions the army went on, towards Brittany, towards Le Mans, towards Germany, and so Middleton, just at the moment where he's maybe metaphorically thinking of a banquet feast, Patton comes in and kind of takes some of the limelight. So run through Middleton's kind of own views of this and what's going on within his command, because it's suddenly he's the bridesmaid, isn't he?
Yes, very much. Now, before I do that, I got to ask you, there's something you've talked about that I'm ignorant of. What was Fritz Bayerlin's reaction to Operation Cobra when he sees all these bombers? I'm not familiar with it. He's the German commander.
It's in James Holland's book, particularly, where he's watching it from the ramparts there, and he's pretty much seeing tanks bouncing across the fields there, hit by repeated hits, and he sends his dispatch riders out to contact. Is it the 262nd Division over to his left that have already been mauled? And people are coming back. His staff officers are coming back completely doolally because of the bombardments. He's actually seeing men taken away in straitjackets. And I forget the quote. I've got it somewhere on my computer, what Bayerlin says at this point. But he's like, I've got nothing left. It's like Pickett at the end in the Gettysburg movie when General Lee says, "Sir, form your brigade," and he says, "Sir, I have no brigade."
Right.
That's kind of how Bayerlin feels at this. He feels the Panzer have just about been wiped out, because they pretty much have just been wiped out, as have the division over to his left. So Bayerlin recognizes this is absolutely this is everything. It's all over now.
Right.
And for my money, Panzer Lehr probably puts up the best fight of any German armored division in Normandy campaign. If other divisions had done what they had, of kind of holding that line south of Tilly-sur-Seine and let the Allies come, the Panzer Lehr made the British pay for every inch they progressed out of Tilly and Fontenay and the Rauray Ridge. So, but the Panzer Lehr are just, they're within a matter of minutes, really, of this bombardment, they have just been smashed.
Okay.
And
Cool.
Ireland recognizes that completely.
I did not know that. Thank you. So getting back to Middleton, so we talk about criticism of him stopping. Well, that's going to happen again because his corps is going to be the one corps going into Brittany, going west. And it's a real race against time to prevent the Germans from being able to build up defenses around all these vital ports that we need to use to supply these modern armies. And at one point, Patton sees Grow and starts chewing him out for stopping. And he's like, why the hell did you stop? And he goes, well, Middleton told us to. And Patton just, kind of shakes his head. And he goes, he used to be a hell of an infantryman. He's like, he doesn't get it. But, Patton is he's for all the praise of Patton, he does set goals a little too lofty for humankind almost. Like, people love to respect the fact that he would push people right to the limit. Well, he would often push people beyond the limit. And the human body does need rest and does need food. And, in his push to get his troops further west, the Sixth Armored does start getting cut off from behind and has to turn around and fight some fights before it can continue on. But, the press isn't going to talk about that. They're going to talk about Patton. And once he takes command, his name is going to be on the headline of every newspaper. Middleton is going to disappear. Middleton has got that sort of unpopular job. Everybody else is racing, east to encircle the German army. That's the exciting campaign. Middleton is racing west to reach a bunch of ports. It doesn't have the same gravitas. I think he does a competent job of it. I think he's a very competent general. Once the ports are, I should say, secure, because a lot of them are never taken during the length of the war. The Germans just, they know what they're doing and they know how desperately they need to hold those ports. We eventually get enough troops to create another army, the U.S. Ninth Army, and that kind of takes over Middleton for a bit, takes over the Brittany area. Middleton then is going to move east with everybody else. And famously, it's going to be his corps that's going to catch the German attack in the Battle of the Bulge right in the teeth. And he does a very competent job. Patton does chew him out at one point saying, why the hell are you holding on to this Bastogne town? You should have pulled back. And Middleton has to sit him down and show him the road net and explain. And Patton goes, you know what, you're right. You're right. So, he is a very competent general, definitely an infantryman, and had served under Patton in Sicily and knew how to take him. He's like, I know this guy's got the big ego. He's going to want all the headlines. I'm fine with that. I know how to do my job. I know how to deal with him.
Yeah, we've got getting some people actually giving the exact quote Biden said. So von Krug, German Army Group B commander, ordered every man to hold their positions on 26th July. Biden replied, all my men are in their positions. None moved because they're dead. So that's Biden's quote there. And Stuart is reminding us from 247 tanks first deployed, there was only 20 left on the eve of Cobra. Oof. Although he does have some of his, self-propelled gun, things like that as well. But his division is already on its knees, but Cobra absolutely smashed it to the ground. And while we've got the image of the memorial up there, one of the things we talked about this before going live, folks, is that most monuments in Normandy, and I expect elsewhere, are commemorating events that have just happened. But the interesting thing about the Avranches one, it's more about what's going to happen next. It's a memorial telling you which direction they're going to go. So when you're standing there, not many people go to Avranches anyway because they're up by the beaches. There's no reference, as we say, to Middleton there or Collins, there's the 4th Armored Division Sherman there, but it's all about Patton and what happened next and that breakout and the pushing on there. And I think that's a bit of a shame because the towns on, there's a little bit in Coutances, there's little monuments to liberation as you go down, but there's nothing really conveying the awesomeness of that 8th Corps push down there. And yes, we can definitely admit there aren't that many Germans ahead of them, but it's a use of armor that absolutely drives miles through enemy countryside. What more can you expect? So I want to know what your interpretation is of Cobra, from either through the lens of Patton or through the lens of you as a historian or through the lens of 8th Corps. What are our takeaways that we should be understanding about Cobra 78 years on?
It was a huge success that, prior to Cobra, the U.S. Army was not being allowed to fight the kind of war that it had been designed for. After Cobra, that's exactly what happens. This is a fully mechanized army. There are no horses. Other armies are still using horses at this point, not the Americans. The U.S. industry has created all these fighters, bombers, tankers, trucks, cargo planes. And all around this idea of winning a war quickly with minimum casualties to the American sons and daughters that will be going overseas. And this is what Cobra allows for. It's like, yes, this is what we were made for. This is what we have. This was our concept of how it should go. And it hasn't been going this way. We've been feeling miserable about it. But now it's going exactly the way we had hoped for. Oh, someone just chimed in with an agreement there. I appreciate that. And it's, Paul, and you agree, I think you agree with it already. It's exciting. That it's not trench warfare. It's not hedgerow fighting. You get that enthusiasm that comes with liberation of all these towns. And, you can't write about this without these tankers and infantrymen going into towns and people throwing flowers and fruit and running up with bottles of wine. We're fighting the good war. It really is sort of the beginning. It's like that capstone moment that everything we've been pushing for is realized.
Yeah, and we're getting comments about the fact that we need to take this in context of there's all still everything happening south of Caen, because next week after this, operations Totalize and Tractable are going to commence. Of course, Germans going to launch Luttich to try and retake Avranches in the World War's silliest plan ever. And you and I have talked about Mortain previously on World War II TV. So there's all that, and then there's Blue Coat that comes in there as well. But this show is about Eighth Corps, and I think you're absolutely right to hone in on that idea, because someone asked earlier about, what about the supplies? What about the repairing of tanks? That's the thing that you've built up since June the 6th. The Americans have built up this supply of stuff behind. You can do an advance of several, there's dozen kilometers a day, and you can keep all your rear lines up with your front lines. We British can just about do it, but we don't have. 11th Armored Division has things like the Rifle Brigade in armored half tracks. We don't have them at the plentiful rates you have, where these two armored divisions and the support troops, it is fully mechanized now. This advance can go fast. It can pick up its speed, and it can keep on going. And the rear elements are going to keep up with the forward elements, which is key, isn't it? And that comes out of the doctrinal approach that the Americans have been putting into it. So you've thought about Middleton.
I was going to just add one thing real quick too, and this is more anecdotal because I've read about it with 4th Armored. I haven't read about it with 6th, but Wood makes the decision to carry numerous jerry cans of gasolines on the backs of his tanks. The logic being, well, you don't want to do that because if the Germans hit you, you blow up more effectively. But what he decided was the ability to get behind the German lines supersedes the danger of having that gasoline on the tanks. And so that single decision enables 4th Armored to move all the faster. It's a risky maneuver, but it pays off. Again, something, one of those decisions, one of those things that we have the ability to do this, therefore we are going to try to do it, and gets results.
And so how much does this influence as the 4th and the 6th and over to the east, the 2nd and the 3rd? Because they have been burdened. Everybody's been burdened by the hedgerows. Everyone's been burdened by the fact you can't do this maneuver warfare. And now maneuver warfare has been demonstrated. So post Cobra, and again, folks, we can be talking about Blue Coat. We can be talking about that. We're talking about 8th Corps today. We're going to do a lot more about Blue Coat in the future. We can't do everything in one go. But how much does this influence and prove to the higher ups that the mobile mechanized warfare is possible in Europe? I mean, we know it's possible in North Africa because of conditions and terrain and movements, but it is possible in Europe. Does this change? Is this a game changer in terms of what people perceive armor can do?
That's a tough one to quantify because, you've got Patton screaming from every church tower that this is what armor can do. And most of the counter arguments from Eisenhower, Bradley, are more like, don't forget the infantry. The infantry is also vital. George, you're too one-sided. You're too narrow-minded. So I haven't really seen that it changes opinions of armor. as just people are just swept up in the amazement of the movement. And, even where you have infantry divisions like 1st ID and 90th, going on this great offensive on these great drives, all of the newspapers, it's photos of tanks. That's what's in the imagination is the tank and the bomber and the fighter plane flying over it. That's the selling point. That is the ideal. And that's the sort of fantasy that goes, I shouldn't say fantasy because there's a lot of reality to that, but that the image of the tank encapsulates what war is going to be in Europe for the next couple of months, if all the way to the end of the war,
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think we'll bring up that map there again, because that kind of shows the state of play. And yes, folks, we realize there's a lot more that follows this. There's, Blue Coat is definitely worth discussion. I'm doing a few days in September. Gareth Davies from the RTR is bringing over a group of people. We're going to do like a 3 or 4 days study of Blue Coat. So I plan to do at least a week on Blue Coat in the future, and I want to do a week on Goodwood at some point. And I was hoping to do this kind of semi-week on Cobra, but I lost Steve Ossad, but I'll get him back later on. So Cobra, in terms of understanding it, in you said there it's a great success. I know what your answer is going to be to this question, but it's the same old one. Is there a tendency for American historians to focus on Cobra and what the Americans are doing, and British historians to focus on over to the east, the things around Caen, and there's a lack of people looking at this as a two-front war and comparing the two? Is that a mistake we still are all guilty of?
Of course, yeah. I mean, I would compare it to Sicily, where Patton really kind of maneuvers around Sicily, where Montgomery's on that sort of straight drive to Messina, and then here you look at this picture, and it's kind of almost a reenactment of Sicily in some ways. And the Americans are critical that taking Caen and Falaise is taking too long, and look what we've been able to achieve. But both armies are facing two different enemies, both grinding them down in their own ways. But the breakout, as you can see, just looking at that center of the map, all those arrows just spreading out in different directions, it's such a release or relief after all that sort of tight elbowed fighting that had gone on. And when I look at that map, Paul, I look at that first line around St. Lo and Caen, and just how much fighting had gone week after week in that area. And then in just days, you're breaking out to Brest, you're circling around Falaise. It's just such a world of difference. And that's the one thing that we Americans, and you, my good friend on the other side of the pond, that we need to keep in mind is that, yes, everybody is working towards the same goal here, but I work towards an American audience. You work more towards a British one. I have more access to American accounts. You have more access to British ones. But I'm always fascinated to hear what you have to say. Like that whole story of Ireland, that was news to me. I'm so ensconced in the weeds, with my Patton research. I had no idea about that. So thanks for teaching me.
Well, every day's a school day, isn't it? None of us know it all, and it's trying to. The more we all try and keep these plates spinning, is that while you're keeping some spinning, others are dropping away. And if you focus on one area, you're limiting what you're learning about other areas. But the thing is, the Germans are on the brink because of Cobra and because of Goodwood starts things, even though Goodwood is debated. It does destroy a lot of German vehicles. They can't replace it. Does change their thinking there. Sepp Dietrich starts thinking about what they're going to do over there. Then Cobra happens. Then Blue Coat happens. Then Lüttich happens, and then you get the Falaise Gap. So all of these things are kind of sequential, but they're overlapping as well. So yeah. It's a little bit complicated to follow the timeline there. And I say Blue Coat definitely gets a bit lost in the weeds, I think, in understanding, because it doesn't have the dramatic distance advantages of Cobra, but it has this fundamental seizing of high ground, Montpanson, the highest point of Normandy, and all that area there. So in terms of just to kind of bring things to an end there, Patton's legacy, Middleton's legacy, is Middleton a little bit overshadowed? Would you like to see Middleton get a bit more credit for this?
I would. The controversy is, who put the tanks in the front, and everybody says Patton. It's even in the movie. But in my research, Middleton gets command. Middleton's in command. He makes a decision that night. It's not until the next night at 6 p.m. that Patton shows up, and people say, oh, he told Middleton to put the tanks in the fore. That's in Ladius Farrago's book. No, he had already done that. He cheated the timeline in his book. And I even went to the Troy Middleton biography that credits Patton with putting the tanks in the front line. But I actually contacted the LSU library. Back then it was called the Middleton Library. And they told me they went and got the interview notes. And Middleton never said that Patton made that call. That was something the author added later. Now, so yes, I would like him to get the credit for making that decision to put the Army, the tanks in the front. Unfortunately, Middleton's name has sort of receded in recent years. Like I said, the LSU library was called the Middleton Library, but some researchers found out, they went through some of his letters when LSU, there was discussion of desegregating the college or the university, and he was vehemently against it and used vulgar language, racist language in his arguments not to allow African Americans into the university. And for that, they've now changed the name. They've taken his name off the library. So, history is not in a vacuum.
No, indeed, and that's an interesting point and worth noting. So, well, I think we've kind of reached a natural end to this. I think it would be definitely worth coming on looking at the Brittany campaign at some point in the future. We did Mayenne with you, of course, in the past. We've done Mortain with you, but
yep.
Yeah, as we said there, I talked to John McManus this weekend. There is still more. There's room for more studies of how these operations link together, isn't there? The work has not all been done yet. There are commanders, Wood, Grow, I think, need more of an appraisal. Lawton Collins, I think, is probably in deserve of a new look at him. I mean, he's overall very good, but of course his own book is, like most books by Cobra, a bit kind of self-promotional. He's great, but there's definitely room for Cobra. So what's the future for the understanding of Cobra and Blue Coat? I think we've said it already. It's kind of historians from different nations working together, I think, is the key to me.
Yes, and just it's funny when those first comments were saying, "Hey, we got to get this thing in context." I mean, how many times we talked about D-Day and people were like, "Oh yeah, and the war ended there." It's like, no, there's a lot more, and we're kind of on the cusp of digging deeper. And in a lot of my research, it's a lot of going through audio interviews and finding those few sentences where the veterans talk about what they saw. And I've got a new appreciation of so many battles because of that. And so we have new techniques to use to research. We have new access. We have access to new materials. And so that, people still write about the American Civil War, the American Revolution. We're still learning new things. And that's what makes what we do so exciting. Yeah.
So to round things off, where are we in terms of the Patton book? The first book is out and we're ready, and the link to it. The second volume is you've submitted it. Is that where we are?
So yes, I've submitted it twice now. It's going to get reviewed by a board at University of Missouri Press, which I'm very confident about because they passed volume 1. It would be a shame if they said no to volume 2. But we're looking at a summer publication. So less than a year from now.
And then what's next? What's the next big project?
Volume 3.
Volume 3.
So volume 2 is just going to take us to the very end of 1944. So it's Third Army on August 1st, 44, December 31st, 44. Volume 3 will be just 1945. I'm reading Peter Caddick Adams right now to know what I'm talking about. He's got that great book, Fire and Steel. Is that it?
Fire and Steel to You and Victory in the West. It's what one country's victory. As usual, published decided, but in different titles in different countries. But yeah, it's a great book. Well, what would you expect from Peter Caddick Adams? And it was so, just on the subject, it was so lovely seeing him back on the mend there. I mean, we were worried we were going to lose him back in June with his heart problems, but he's back up there firing on all cylinders again, and it's so great because
was he at the conference?
He was, and I think he's verging on attaining national treasure status. I think in the UK, I think he's on the brink of kind of getting that. Everybody knows he's just a wonderful guy, just a human being. Proud to call him a friend. So we are. So volume 2 is submitted, volume 3, and then I'm hopefully going to be bumping up into you in August when you're coming over to do some more ground research. So
I'll be coming over in the end of August, and basically I'm going to be going over all the battlefields of volume 2 just to make sure I know what I'm talking about.
Just make sure you got your norths and souths right and haven't got got the compass wrong. But It's been great talking to you, Kevin, and we've kept the rabbit holes under control, I think, pretty well. I mean, there's all sorts of things we could have got into there. And yeah, definitely, folks, it's these kind of shows where you realize that no matter what you cover, there's always more to do. And yes, there's more to Cobra. There's more to Blue Coat. Lutich could do with an examination again. All of these are, whatever we cover, there's always more we could cover. But I'm going to bring it to an end now. So, folks, I'll just take you off screen, bring you back in a second. So, folks, I'm off this weekend. And then next week, we are talking ground war in the Pacific, which will have some usual kind of Marines and stuff that John McManus is going to be on. We've also got some interesting stories. Matt McLachlan is joining us about a breakout from a prisoner of war camp in Australia, the only ground combat in Australia. We're talking about Filipino Muslim guerrillas on Monday, which will be an interesting show. Mojo Warriors, which will be really fascinating. So there's some really great, interesting shows coming up. Sol David's coming on to about his book. Then we're going to aviation the week after. Paul Hammond is going to be talking about the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs. And then we move on to there. I'm still planning two or 3 weeks of Alamein shows in October. We've got Eastern Front weeks coming up. I'm looking at doing shows about the Balkans. I found some historians to do some stuff about the 4th and 5th offensives there. Says Morrow Warriors. I said, why did I say Mojo, Brendan? I'm thinking of Austin Powers there. Morrow Warriors. Yeah, my mistake. My bad. I was thinking of Austin Powers there, getting my mojo back. But anyway, so I'm going to bring Kevin back in to say goodbye. So as always, it's great talking to you. I can't wait to see you later in August, and we will put some history wrongs to right and discuss some theories and get out there and maybe do some stuff. It'll be great seeing you in person again. So
always a pleasure, my friend.
Thanks talking to us and everybody else for watching. This is Paul Woodadge for World War II TV. I will see you all again next week. Cheers, everybody. Bye.
Cheers.